We were like in the middle of brushing.
All right.
She's about to say, give me my bag. Hey, you fucking moved it. Damn, people say thank you, please.
Okay.
I feel good. Hey, come on,
Okay.
Hey, come on.
We left off when we reviewed this a little bit. We're going to watch a video that sort of summarizes this, and my suggestion is that you draw out what's on the video, because I think it's going to help you to understand this particular pathway. So hormonal control of glomerular filtration rate. Actually, sometimes they put another A in here, so they call it the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAAS. So we need to remember that this is activated only when we have a decrease in the blood volume or blood pressure. So a decrease, okay? And what this system is going to do is it's going to manipulate the reabsorption of water in the kidneys, or it's going to cause vasodilation of nephron capillaries, specifically arterioles, in order to reestablish the blood pressure. So this doesn't happen when you have high blood pressure. This happens when your blood pressure or blood volume is low. So we're going to reabsorb water in order to increase the blood volume, and when we increase the blood volume, that automatically is going to increase the pressure. Okay, so there's this cascade effect that happens, and the video is going to explain it much better. So you might want to wait and just draw out the video. You'll have plenty of time to draw it out. So cells in the juxtamedullary apparatus, so these are cells that are adjacent to the kidney tubule, secrete an enzyme called renin. And this renin acts on, it's a hormone, it's a plasma protein, and it's classified as a hormone called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is made by the liver. So you'll see this in the video. So the liver is going to secrete angiotensinogen into the bloodstream. There's going to be a detection of a decrease in blood volume or blood pressure. Renin is going to be secreted by the kidneys. And then we have this cascade effect where we have the conversion of a couple different things into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 does a couple of different things. It will vasoconstrict arterioles, and it will also target your thirst centers, but the last thing that it does is it targets the renal medulla, the adrenal cortex, to secrete another hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone targets cells in the distal tubule and the collecting duct, and it causes the reabsorption of sodium. Water follows sodium. So it's an indirect way to reabsorb water. Water is not being directly reabsorbed as the result of aldosterone. Sodium is being reabsorbed, and water follows sodium. Okay, so we're going to watch a video, and the video I think does a much better job of sort of breaking it down with pictures, which is what I would suggest you write down. I would suggest you draw this diagram on the video as opposed to writing down words. You'll remember the diagram. Okay, you might not remember all of the words if you try to memorize those. So let's cut to the video.
What is MyHeritage.com? It's a website that helps me understand who I am by exploring the world.
Okay, so one of our Instagram friends requested a review video on the RAAS system, and that stands for the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So I'm going to make this very short and sweet, because I think it's easiest described with pictures and just kind of getting to the point, because it's really easy to understand really when you have that at this level. First thing, I want to make sure that we understand what the RAAS system does. Like, why is it in place? What is it supposed to do? So essentially, in response to low blood pressure or in response to low serum sodium, this system can kick in to help compensate for that. And when I say serum sodium, remember, when there is low sodium, that means there is low fluid volume, right?
So, that's very important to remember, okay? Water follows sodium. So when there's low serum sodium, that means that there's low sodium levels in the blood. So by association, there will also be low water levels. Water is what makes up the majority of your blood. So when there are low serum sodium levels, there's going to be less water in your blood than there should be, which translates into a lowering of your overall blood volume. Okay, that's how those things are associated with one another. So when you may hear it in different ways, or it might say low fluid level, okay? Really it boils down to water, because all of the fluids in your body, the base for those fluids is always water. That's it. That's really the only type of fluid that we have to work with in the human body. Okay, now that water is going to contain different things in it depending on where it's at. But still, the base solvent for any solutions in your body is always going to be water. Okay.
Because where salt goes, water follows. So if we don't have a lot of salt, then we don't have a lot of fluid. You don't have a lot of fluid on board, then your blood pressure is going to be decreased. So that makes sense. Okay, so this system is in place essentially to regulate blood pressure by bringing it up. Okay, and it does that with this whole kind of process of conversion and reactions. So let's begin with first thing first. So our liver releases a hormone called angiotensinogen. Okay, now when we're talking about hormone being released, we mean in the blood. Now, so angiotensinogen is released, right? In response to that, the kidney is going to shoot out an enzyme called renin. Now together, this enzyme renin and this hormone angiotensinogen, they react, and you're going to end up with angiotensin, let me spell that right, angiotensin 1, okay? Now when angiotensin 1 is trucking along in our bloodstream and gets to our lungs, in response to this circulating, is going to release ACE. Now this should look familiar because this is the level where ACE inhibitors work. ACE is an angiotensin converting enzyme. So when people take ACE inhibitors, what it's doing is it's stopping this enzyme from being released, right? Because we know that the ultimate goal is to raise blood pressure. But if we don't have this ACE release at this point, if we actually stop the conversion at this point, then we're not going to get to our end product and we're not going to raise blood pressure. So this is how we can stabilize blood pressure.
So, question. Individuals that take ACE inhibitors, it's a type of drug category, okay? What condition are those people suffering from that a doctor would prescribe a medication that interferes with this pathway? What is wrong with the patient who is on an ACE inhibitor?
Too much of it.
What do they have? What? Well, high blood pressure, right? This system is meant to increase your blood pressure. If we interfere with any of the steps in this system, it's not going to raise the blood pressure. It's going to stabilize the blood pressure, keep it from getting any higher, obviously. So an ACE inhibitor is a category of drug that's very often given to people who have high blood pressure, because we don't want anything to cause that blood pressure to go up anymore. Now, very rarely are ACE inhibitors given just by themselves. They're generally given with other drugs because, like Hope said, a lot of times the blood pressure has to do with plaque buildup in the coronary arteries, right? We learned about that. We learned about coronary artery disease. So, generally people that have high blood pressure are going to take multiple medications because there are multiple things in the body that need to be targeted in order to make that person healthier. So an ACE inhibitor, if you ever hear that when you're, and you'll hear it if you guys are in the hospitals working, an ACE inhibitor is a drug used to treat a person with high blood pressure or hypertension, okay?
Okay. Now, as this is trucking along into our system, ACE and angiotensin 1 together are going to make angiotensin 2. Okay? Now, angiotensin 2 works on the level of our adrenal glands, and it also works on the level of our kidneys, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So essentially, angiotensin 2 is going to get to our adrenal glands, right? And it's going to create aldosterone. And this is our end product. Now, this whole system is really a twofold type of system. One, it's going to create aldosterone, and aldosterone itself is going to have some effects on the body. And two, remember I said angiotensin 2 actually works on the kidney level as well. It's going to do something there as well. So first, let's focus on the aldosterone. So we know when aldosterone is created, aldosterone creation is actually going to help blood pressure regulation. And so how does that do that? Well, when we have aldosterone, we actually are increasing the reabsorption of sodium. So if we increase the reabsorption of sodium, that means that we are increasing the fluid that we have on board, which essentially is going to increase our blood pressure, right? So here's our first way that aldosterone is going to work on our bodies to increase blood pressure. Now this number 2 that I have here is really a side note that we have to keep in mind when somebody is releasing aldosterone in the body, because we know that aldosterone decreases potassium because it's leaving through the urine, okay? So this is a side note to keep in mind with that. So the first way is sodium levels are reabsorbed, they're increased, blood pressures increase. Now remember I said that angiotensin 2 also works at the level of the kidneys? Well, it does. It actually is going to cause vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction in the arterioles. And so vasoconstriction in the arterioles is going to increase the blood pressure, right? We know that the more narrow our arteries become, the more narrow our vessels become, the higher the blood pressure is going to be. So this is the kind of our twofold way. So we have our vasoconstriction in our arterioles that increase our blood pressure, and we have the increased reabsorption of sodium that's going to increase our blood pressure. Okay? Short and sweet, the RAAS system. So let's go through that again. So first thing, let's make it a color so we can look at it. Let's do red. Liver releases angiotensinogen, right? In response to that in our bloodstream, the kidney releases renin. Renin and angiotensinogen together make angiotensin 1. When that reaches our lungs are going to release ACE. ACE and angiotensin 1 make angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is going to work at the level of the adrenal glands and the kidneys, right? When angiotensin 2 gets to the adrenal glands, it's going to make aldosterone. And aldosterone will increase our blood pressure because it increases sodium reabsorption, which is going to increase the amount of fluid that we have. But we gotta keep in mind that aldosterone also depletes potassium. So we have to think about that from a nursing perspective as far as client care, preventive measures. In addition to the aldosterone release, we know that angiotensin 2 at the level of the kidney is going to cause vasoconstriction in the arterioles, which will increase blood pressure as well. So there you have it, short and sweet, the RAAS system.
So as a nurse or a doctor, what do you do to counter the potassium loss associated with the RAAS system?
Give them a supplement.
Give them intravenous potassium. They'll get a potassium drip. That's what happens. Okay, so very often when you go into the hospital and they hook you up to an IV, one of the things they'll generally give you, since you're getting IV fluids, it'll have a tendency to make you pee more. Sometimes you're losing potassium as well, and they'll give you a IV potassium. Okay, let's go back
If you have any
to,
questions, you can
let's go back to our, lecture notes. Okay, where am I at? Okay. Let's talk specifically about reabsorption and secretion. If you want to just draw it on one of your diagrams, maybe that's easier for you guys to understand. So reabsorption is where we're going to recover useful materials in the proximal tubule, and secretion is where we're going to have this last chance opportunity to get rid of things in the distal tubule or the collecting tube. So specifically, let's just take a look at what exactly we're dealing with. In the proximal tubule, so as soon as the filtrate leaves Bowman's capsule, the space, and enters the proximal tubule, we start reabsorbing things. We reabsorb 70% of what we filtered gets reabsorbed. So when I said that we really do over-filter the blood, we do. And then 70% of what we filtered out, we take back into the paratubular capillaries. We reabsorb them. Okay, 65% of water is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. 100% of glucose and amino acids are reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. So, you might wonder then, how do you get glucose in the urine in the situation of a diabetic? It's like trying to fill a glass that's already full. If there's blood, if the blood is already saturated with, let's say, glucose, and in a diabetic, there's no way for the patient to get the glucose out of the bloodstream. They don't have insulin. They can't unlock the cells to get the glucose into the cells. So the bloodstream is full of glucose, okay? That glucose spills over into the urine. It can't be reabsorbed. You can't put any more into the bloodstream. So it starts to spill over into the urine, and we can detect the glucose in a simple urinalysis, okay? Amino acids are another thing. We don't want to lose amino acids. They're the building blocks of protein. We store those. We need those. There's zero reason for us to be getting rid of amino acids because we reuse those to build new proteins in the body. So something that we don't want to excrete. And this is mainly where certain ions like potassium and chloride and sodium, this is where the majority of those particular ions are reabsorbed. Okay? Now, we move to the middle part of our renal tube, which is the loop of Henle. Okay? Okay. Each limb, so we have the one that, so from the proximal tubule, we go down. So that's the descending limb. And then we come back up the ascending limb. Those two limbs have different permeabilities to different things. On the way down, we reabsorb water only. That's it. On the way back up, sodium and chloride only get reabsorbed. Okay? At the end of the loop of Henle, as we're starting to enter, as the filtrate is, starting to enter the distal tubule, at that point, what we have left in the filtrate is just the bad solutes, really, and very little water. It's very, very concentrated, okay? Because we reabsorbed the majority of the water, okay? So my filtrate is running through my nephron. It runs through the proximal tubule. It runs through the loop of Henle. And as I'm approaching the distal tubule, what I'm dealing with now is very, very concentrated filtrate. There's nothing left in the filtrate at this point that the body needs. Anything in the filtrate at that point is going to be excreted in your urine. But it's not technically urine yet. We have to make some adjustments. Okay? And those adjustments are made in the distal tubule and then in the collecting duct as well. Okay, so let's talk about the final tweaking before we actually have urine in the renal tubule. Okay. Very low in water, as I said, hardly any water in the filtrate. It's very, very concentrated, lots of bad stuff in there. Okay? Now, at this point, we're gonna have some very selective reabsorption that's gonna be under the control of hormones. So these hormones are only going to reabsorb certain things if the body needs them reabsorbed. It's very selective. It doesn't happen the same in all cases. So selective reabsorption. And we also have selective secretion of certain things. Maybe it's ions, maybe it's toxins, perhaps it's drugs. So every individual, this is going to be very different depending on what you've ingested and what your kidneys have filtered. So what we selectively reabsorb or selectively secrete in the distal tubule is very tailored to each individual. Okay? Now, this is where most of the byproducts of drugs are secreted into the tubule, which is why a urinalysis can give you an indication of whether or not a person has been using drugs, either illicit drugs or we can also test for some prescription drugs. But most of the time, we do a urinalysis because we want to know if a person is using illicit drugs. Okay? Urine test, obviously not as good as a blood test because the concentrations of these drugs in the urine will not be as high as the concentrations that are in the blood, which is why if you really want to know, you do a blood test.
So they can't specifically know if they're not taking regular medications? Or if
Well, when you do a drug test, you're required to take your medication list to the testing facility. Yeah,
But can they
because there
identify-
are some drugs that will mimic drugs. For instance, let's say that you're on, like Vicodin or some opioid painkiller for an injury that you had, right? Which a lot of people are prescribed. Opioids will mimic in the urine heroin or opioid illicit drugs. So this is why you have to actually have your prescriptions available, especially if you are taking very strong narcotics that are prescribed to you, because those, your doctor may think it's a false positive for a street drug, when it's actually a drug that you've been prescribed to take.
But isn't that why they tell you you shouldn't eat anything before because like something show up on like a test like? is it
Yeah, I
like
mean,
poppy
you
seeds and stuff?
The whole myth of eating poppy seeds and testing positive for heroin, the amount of poppy seeds that you have to ingest it's astronomical. Could it happen? Yeah, if you're, shoveling handfuls of poppy seeds in your mouth, I suppose it could, because it's the same thing. I mean, it's a derivative of the poppy plant. So you could test positive for heroin, but the likelihood of that happening is exceptionally low. All right, in the collecting tubule, we have urine. Now, remember, the collecting tubule is not part of the nephron. Not part. Nephron is only the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, and then the three parts of the tube, proximal, loop of Henle, and distal. That's the nephron components. Collecting tube is just the duct system that empties the urine through the kidney so that it can be excreted. Okay, not part of the nephron.
The nephron is subproximal.
The nephron is just the Bowman's capsule with the glomerulus and the three parts of the tube, proximal, loop of Henle, distal. Okay, we do have some selective reabsorption and secretion, usually of water or sodium in the collecting tube. Again, this is driven by hormones, and it's only on a need-be basis. Okay, and we're going to talk about how how hormones can tweak your urine at this junction, at this particular point in urine production. So aldosterone, we know, is a hormone that causes the reabsorption of water. But aldosterone does not cause reabsorption of water directly. It causes the reabsorption of sodium, and the water follows the sodium. There's another hormone produced by the body that is directly responsible for absorbing water, and that hormone we're going to talk about now. Well, let's talk about this first. I forgot this one.
Osmosis.
Okay. Urine volume and concentration has to do with water. That's really, it's got to do with water. The water that's reabsorbed in the first part of the kidney tubule that we talked about in the proximal tubule and the descending limb, you cannot tweak that, okay? Hormones cannot tweak that. That is obligatory water reabsorption. Your body is going to reabsorb 85% of the water in those locations regardless. There's nothing you can do to change that, all right? The part that we can tweak is when we get down to the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So we got 15% of the water that we can play with there, okay? When water is reabsorbed at this point, we call it facultative water reabsorption. It's on a needed, as needed basis as to whether or not we're gonna reabsorb that water. If we're well hydrated, we're not gonna reabsorb that water. We're gonna let it pass out in the urine. So your urine's gonna end up being more water than solute, and it's gonna look very, very pale. If for some reason you don't have enough water in your body, in your blood, in your tissues, your body is gonna reabsorb that water, and your urine is going to be more concentrated. So when we're dehydrated, meaning our tissues in our body do not have the volume of water that they need, your kidneys will reabsorb all the water that they can, this facultative reabsorption. They'll reabsorb all of it back in, and your urine will be very concentrated. It will look very, very dark yellow, okay? On the other hand, if we're well hydrated, our kidneys are going to produce urine that's very, very pale, okay? And that's how we get the different colors. It's really the amount of water that is being allowed to be excreted. Now, the reabsorption of water, okay, not sodium. The reabsorption of water is controlled by a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, okay, ADH. It's similar to aldosterone in that both of those hormones cause the body to reabsorb water, but they act differently because aldosterone, it causes the reabsorption of sodium, water follows. Antidiuretic hormone, it reabsorbs water directly, okay? Sometimes you'll hear it called vasopressin. Older nurses, doctors will call it vasopressin instead of ADH. You guys ready? Okay, so let's talk about how this ADH works. ADH causes special water channels in the distal tubule and the collecting duct to open. These are called aquaporins. If you had AP biology, you've heard of aquaporins. They're special channels that are only open for water molecules. So it's a way for water to quickly move across cell membranes, okay? The stimulus for the secretion of ADH is blood osmolarity, an increase in blood osmolarity. Okay, so what does that mean? Too much solute, not enough solvent. Well, what's the solvent? Water. The solvent in your body for everything is water. So when we lose water from our blood, we need it back. Okay? So it's a different trigger than aldosterone. Aldosterone, the trigger is a decrease in blood volume or a decrease in blood pressure. In the case of antidiuretic hormone, the trigger is an increase in blood osmolarity. Or a decrease in blood volume. Like, what do I mean? You're hemorrhaging. You're bleeding to death. Okay? You're losing a lot of blood. You're going from 4 liters of blood circulating in your circulatory system to 3 liters of blood. Okay? So, antidiuretic hormone communicates with, remember it's a hormone, so it's released into the bloodstream. It communicates with cells in the distal tubule and the collecting duct. And it tells them to open up the water channels, the aquaporins. And water is directly reabsorbed from the tube into the peritubular capillaries. As a result, blood osmolarity comes back down because we're adding more solvent to the blood, and we're good to go. Now, how does this affect you peeing? Well, obviously, if you're reabsorbing water, you're not going to pee as much. And when you do pee, the concentration of your urine is going to be pretty highly concentrated.
Wait, I have a question.
Yeah.
You know when you like need to pee really badly and then all of a sudden
When you what?
When you need to pee really badly and then all of a sudden it just goes away? Like what is that?
That has to do with the micturation reflex. We haven't talked about that. We can, if you want to, we can talk about it. But it's your brain. The micturation reflex is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It's controlled by your brain. So sometimes your brain signals, I mean, we know how the nervous system works, so sometimes the signals can turn off. And so you don't, like, I know what you mean, like, it's like you have to pee so bad and then all of a sudden, it's just, the urge isn't there. That's completely neural. That's not, it's not part of your urinary system that's causing that to happen. It's up here. It's signals of your autonomic nervous system communicating with the muscles in your urinary system.
Oh.
Yeah, it's your brain. Because sometimes you can think yourself into not having to pee.